Hey, everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, people have reported experiences with Entra ID account lockouts over the weekend. Also, fears have been mounting over another potentially large round of layoffs at Intel. And Google backs out of sweeping changes to kill off third-party cookies in Google Chrome. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes Master Packager, an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. And of course, also brought to you by Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. Over the weekend, organizations were seeing widespread Entra ID account lockouts triggered by false positives in the rollout of a new Microsoft Entra ID leaked credentials detection app called MACE. That's capital MACE. These accounts were automatically locked out of the tenant, with numerous users impacted per organization. The locked out accounts showed no signs of compromise, such as suspicious sign-ins, and were protected with MFA. Over the weekend, Microsoft did not publicly confirm that these lockouts were occurring, but apparently did tell one organization at least that the issue was caused by something with the rollout of that MACE credential revocation application or feature. As we got out of weekend mode, Microsoft did move to confirm the actual weekend Entra ID account lockouts and suggested that they were caused by invalidation of short-lived user refresh tokens that were mistakenly logged into internal systems. In a status update, they said, "We have no indication of unauthorized access to these tokens, and if we determine there were any unauthorized access, we will revoke our standard security incident response and communication process." Microsoft said impacted customers can give the confirm user safe feedback in Entra for the flagged users to restore their access to their accounts. Microsoft also said they will be publishing a post-incident report, but that has not yet been published at the time of this recording. So yeah, if you're affected by that, then obviously there's a way to restore access to the accounts. However, that probably would have been nice to know over the weekend and probably saved a lot of manual effort for support team. Just before I recorded last week's episode of the podcast, it was being widely reported that MITRE, which is something I mention pretty much every week on the podcast, that's the foundation that tracks publicly recorded vulnerabilities. So like when I mention a CVE-2025- example, that is the public record for a vulnerability in the MITRE database. Well, last week, there were widespread reports that the funding for MITRE was going to expire and that it would not be renewed. Now, luckily, at the 11th hour, the US government agreed to continue funding the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program, that CVE program. And it appears that although the US CISA has moved to extend the contract, at least for now, MITRE may be taking steps to safeguard itself from problems in the future by forming a non-profit. So obviously, all tech companies benefit from having this single source for vulnerabilities. So I guess in future, if this funding is cut and they're in a non-profit phase, they'll be able to reach out to some of the large vendors possibly for funding. That was startling news last week. I chose not to re-record and put it in the podcast that went out last week because I saw that there was that reprieve, so it didn't seem like as urgent a story anymore. But it's still worth reporting on. Speaking of the US CISA, on Wednesday, the US CISA warned of heightened breach risks after compromise of the legacy Oracle Cloud servers earlier this year and highlighted significant threat to enterprise networks. Obviously, if you listen to the podcast, that leak is something that I've already covered on previous episodes. But the CISA said, quote, "The nature of the reported activity presents potential risk to organizations and individuals, particularly where credential material may be exposed, reused across separate unaffiliated systems, or embedded. At this time, the scope and impact remains unconfirmed." They went on to state that when credential material is embedded, it's difficult to discover and can enable long-term unauthorized access if exposed. The compromise of credential material, including usernames, emails, passwords, authentication tokens, and encryption keys, can pose significant risk to enterprise environments. So I guess an example of hard coding or embedding credentials would be in scripts within applications, automation tools, etc. So perhaps for example, code within a GitHub repository, that's a whole other set of problems. But credentials in scripts, back in the day, packaging applications, there were some vendors who would leave properties where you could put in credentials within the MSIs. Luckily, that practice went away a long time ago, so it's not very common anymore. But that's another example of having these credentials exposed and embedded somewhere where they could be manipulated. The U.S. Cybersecurity Agency, according to BleepingComputer.com, also released guidance to mitigate the risks linked to the resulting credential leak, urging network defenders to reset affected users' passwords, replace hard-coded or embedded credentials with secure authentication methods, enforce phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication wherever possible, and monitor authentication logs for suspicious activity. According to BleepingComputer.com, Microsoft has released emergency Windows Server updates to address a known issue preventing Windows containers from launching. The issue affects only containers running under Hyper-V isolation mode, which allows multiple containers to run simultaneously on a single Windows host inside separate virtual machines. Microsoft has released out-of-band security updates for this for Server 2019, 2022, and 2025. So if you're experiencing this issue, you'll want to get that update. Cisco has released security updates for a high-severity WebEx vulnerability that allows unauthenticated attackers to gain client-side remote code execution using malicious meeting invite links. It's tracked as CVE-2025-20236, and this flaw was found in the WebEx custom URL parser and can be exploited by tricking users into downloading arbitrary files. And this lets threat actors execute arbitrary commands on systems running unpatched software in low-complexity attacks. It said that an attacker could exploit this vulnerability by persuading a user to click a crafted meeting invite link and download arbitrary files. A successful exploit could allow the attacker to execute arbitrary commands with the privileges of the targeted user. The bug impacts Cisco WebEx app installations regardless of OS or system configuration, and there are no workarounds, so software updates are required to block potential exploitation attempts, according to BleepingComputer.com. A vulnerability tracked as CVE-2025-24054, which was patched with the March Windows update, so some time ago now, is an NTLM hash leaking vulnerability that Microsoft at the time had rated as less likely to be exploited. Well, it was actually reportedly exploited within just 8 days of its disclosure, according to theregister.com. They report that in the initial wave of attacks, phishing emails lured victims to download a Dropbox-hosted zip archive called xd.zip. Inside were 4 booby-trapped files, including a .library-ms file that exploited the vulnerability. Simply unzipping the archive, or in some cases just viewing the folder in Windows Explorer, was enough to trigger an outbound SMB authentication attempt, leaking the victim's net NTLM v2 hash to a remote server controlled by the attackers. So just a reminder again that vulnerabilities on average are exploited within 7 days of public disclosure. And in this instance, even those vulnerabilities that are seemingly maybe less severe than others are potentially there for cyber gangs to exploit and game to their own advantage. Security Online reported about another vulnerability, CVE-2025-32434, which is a remote code execution vulnerability in the popular PyTorch, and it affects PyTorch versions below version 2.5.1 and resides in the torch.load function, specifically when invoked with the parameter waits underscore only equals true, and this one carries a severity score of 9.3 out of 10, so this is way up there in terms of criticality. A patched version 2.6.0 is now available. So if you do use this, you'll want to get that updated as soon as possible. The Verge has reported that Google's plan to phase out third-party cookies in Chrome is officially over. In an update published on Tuesday, Google's Privacy Sandbox VP Anthony Chavez said the company has decided to maintain their current approach to offering users third-party cookie choice in Chrome. I've reported on this over the last couple of years, and like a lot of the comments on this is, oh, well, of course, like they just bowed down to advertisers and they gave advertisers what they wanted. From what I could see with the newly proposed system, they seem to actually be kind of working around regulations that was making it harder for advertisers to glean the kind of information they might want from traditional cookies. So I thought really their attempts was more of a way to re-engineer and re-architect to get more information to the advertisers through a new method. So I don't know. I guess maybe there was enough resistance to the new approach. Maybe it was just too complicated for advertisers and for web developers and just general hosts and everything else. I'm not sure why this has died on the vine, but surely the speculation and the comments suggest it's placating to advertisers. Microsoft has made a feature for Windows 365 now generally available, and that is the new snapshot health indicator for their point-in-time restore snapshots. They say it's designed to provide IT administrators with critical information about snapshot health, which enables them to make more informed decisions when restoring cloud PCs. So the status can show that a snapshot that you want to restore to is healthy or unhealthy, and healthy snapshots are reportedly those with a higher probability of successful restoration. Conversely, unhealthy snapshots have a lower probability of success. While admins are not restricted from using unhealthy snapshots, the indicator serves as a caution, informing them of the potential risks associated with restoring these snapshots. They say that this transparency is crucial for IT admins as it helps them avoid unsuccessful restoration attempts and minimizes downtime. They say that the health of a snapshot is determined by two main parameters: virtual machine agent health and session host health. Agent health refers to the status of the virtual machine agent, while session host health pertains to the status of the session host, which, okay, that's two parameters. That doesn't seem indicative of if a snapshot is necessarily healthy or not, I would think. But I guess maybe this health is whether or not you can restore to the snapshot, not if that's going to be a productive thing to do, right? Because I remember when the restoration points were first rolled out, there was a bit of a qualifying point about rotating passwords, which are pretty common in most enterprises nowadays, that if you restore to a certain point and it's got cached credentials from a password that had since been rotated, then that could cause disruption and problems, which kind of in general makes these checkpoint restorations problematic. So, it's good to have the feature, and it's good definitely to have this indicator. But personally, I would not be leaning on checkpoint restorations myself. So this one's a story, non-story at the time of this recording, but apparently Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops version 2503 is generally available, only it's not, it seems. It looks like it was pulled back pretty quickly after it was first announced. I did see that some of the features included, interestingly, native Uber agent integration, which is obviously a big step forward since the acquisition of Uber Agent. I guess we'll have to wait and see if they re-release it again before the end of the week. You could probably expect that it is going to be released soon, but perhaps maybe they jumped the gun and published the new version sooner than they had anticipated. But yeah, New version coming, and it looks like the native Uber agent integration can be expected. Google Gemini is testing a ChatGPT-like scheduled tasks feature called Scheduled Actions, which will allow you to automate tasks. BelievComputer.com states that once available, you'll be able to create a task that will be triggered at a specific time, and these tasks will be performed automatically. This means a task will execute even when the user is offline. They report that Google plans to launch the Scheduled Tasks feature for everyone in the coming weeks. Bloomberg reported that Intel is set to lay off more than 20% of its workforce in a move to streamline operations and reduce bureaucratic inefficiencies. A spokesperson for Intel Ireland told RT News that the company is not commenting on the Bloomberg report as it is just rumor and speculation. If this is true, and there's a further 20% workforce reduction at Intel, that is huge and it's devastating because there's already been so many laid off there over the last few years. So, I feel terrible for Intel employees at this time, and unfortunately, the tech industry is still in dramatic flux. In more worrying news for employees at a large tech vendor, the Register reported that all U.S. cloud employees, sales or otherwise, at IBM are required to return to the office at least 3 days a week per week at designated strategic locations. Several current and former IBM employees who have spoken to the Register about IBM's work directives argue that these policies represent stealth layoffs because older and presumably more highly compensated employees tend to be less willing to uproot their lives and families where applicable than the early professional hires. So the inference there being that young people will up and relocate to one of these strategic locations, whereas people with more experience are like, nah, you're good, I'm out. And I guess it probably gets around them having to do layoffs by just forcing their hand. IBM is playing a dangerous game, as are many large employers who are doing this. But now this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. I will keep it short for this week because I'm sure, as you could probably already hear, my voice is pretty strained because I'm sick once again. But one thing I did want to highlight is that PCWorld.com had an interesting article on Microsoft actually published their own weekly explaining why TPM makes Windows 11 PCs better for you, essentially around the security that TPM provides, such as like file encryption and so on. Of course, as PC World reports, the TPM is a pretty big stumbling block for some enterprises and for some consumer customers in terms of upgrading to Windows 11 because they have older processors that don't support vTPM or they don't have an actual TPM chip. So, it's cool. It provides benefit, but it is a blocker for upgrade for some. Hopefully, it turns out to be a net positive going forward, though. And if you want to read up on, what the benefits are that TPM brings, I'll share a link to that article with this episode, which is episode 383, and you can find that at 5bytespodcast.com. But yeah, my voice is strained, so I'll leave it there for this week, and I'll catch you next week.